Well, a friend of mine said it was kind of a moment of sobriety from an alcoholic that had decided this. And I think that's what it turns out to be. I'm not sure any of it was ever really serious. If you go back to that memorandum of understanding, that was effectively an agreement that gave the Iranians virtually everything they wanted. I wouldn't call it a surrender document. I would simply say what they fought the war for is what they get. We, on the other hand, were not necessarily going to profit in any particular way. In other words, we saw no strategic gain from it. At least Donald Trump didn't. And, he's one of these people that keeps talking about you've got to open the strait, open the strait, open the strait. He fails to point out that the strait was open until we attacked Iran. So, let's get the strait open, Donald. I agree with you, and let's not worry so much about the rest of the stuff. But unfortunately, he's not a free agent. So let me give you some points that I think your listening audience will appreciate. Point number one is the Iranians do not trust Donald Trump. They have no confidence in anything he says, no confidence in the stability of his decisions. That's very important. Secondly, international investors. We're talking about people that are in the business of financing things like refineries, oil infrastructure, mining, and so forth. They have no confidence in Trump's ability to reestablish stability in the region. They see the Middle East as a place where they will not invest or, lend money until they're absolutely certain that there will be no more war. So when he talks about, well, we're going to have this agreement and it's going to be so good and we're going to win, and after we win, everything's going to be better, nobody believes that. So you're not going to see any oil or gas infrastructure rebuilt until, I would argue, the United States and Donald Trump are effectively marginalized or completely out of it. Trump represents instability right now. Investors and leaders believe Trump will ensure endless destruction from endless wars, and that means, if you're in finance and business, endless losses for financiers and investors. Now, the situation today is much worse than it was when he signed the Memorandum of Understanding. The continuation of the war as he's waging it right now, which is escalating, Daryl, is going to lead to oil price increases, something which he's been able to suppress by manipulating the markets and Wall Street. So I think in a couple of months, we're looking at $150 a barrel, and it could go much higher. This means that we're also looking at a massive global downturn, which the United States, given its incredible debt, may not recover from for 20 years. So I think those, from your standpoint, from people in Vancouver, from people in Canada who invest and want to know where is the market going to go and what's going to happen, what will or won't work, I think those are pretty grim points, but I think they're the truth.
Yeah, so another point of confusion, we just got to work through this confusion that that I got, Doug. There was multiple times it was stated that we won the war, we won, and obviously if, Iran is, bombing nearby nations, 2 U.S. military troops were killed. And then I just read a headline earlier that the Pentagon knew that over 100 U.S. soldiers were injured in these attacks by Iran. And so, it doesn't seem like we won anything if we're still actively, bombing, we're still actively putting in the blockade and such. And so, it's some people may be more delusional if they're believing that, and not to insult anybody, but it's just like if we won, then we shouldn't still be in this position, right?
Oh, no, you're 100% correct. This is not the first time in American history we've been through this. A lot of people today do not realize that Americans in overwhelming numbers opposed our entry into World War I. That was a very difficult problem for Woodrow Wilson and his friends in the banking system to drag us into that war. He managed to do it, obviously, and we had a similar problem at the end of the war. He kept saying, well, we won. And people said, well, how is it that we won? What did we win? And his argument was, we're making the world safe for democracy, of course, which is, as you would say, there's an 8-letter word for that. And that was complete nonsense. And we lost 1,000 dead in every battle that we fought in. We only fought for 110 days. So imagine that, 1,000 dead in each battle. By the way, we did not tell Americans at home how many men we were losing as we lost them. We slow rolled it. You know, by the time the war ended, we had 318,000 casualties and 110,000 dead. We did not advertise that. We slow rolled it. And there were a lot of unhappy people. And people said, what did we win? Well, we defeated Germany, all right. So what's that mean? Well, Germany is now a democracy. We created all these little states all over Europe. They're all democracies. Uh-huh. And what about the Soviet Union and Bolshevism? Oh, well, you know, that'll work out. You know, we've been down this road before. Now, this time, I think Donald Trump's in the worst of all possible positions. He started the war and said, we've got to effect regime change. We got to get rid of this regime. We got to have to have a new government that will work with us. Okay, that failed. And people said, well, if that failed, what are you going to do? Well, we can't let Iran have a nuclear weapon. Okay, so what are you going to do? Well, we're going to bomb. Well, how's that gone? Well, that hasn't worked. Well, what are you going to do now? Well, I'm going to destroy Iran. Remember the statement, civilization gone in a night. I mean, only a complete lunatic.
It's like praise be to Allah and some other stuff. Yeah.
Only a complete lunatic would make such a statement. And now where are we? Well, suddenly it's all about the Gulf. Got to reopen the Gulf, reopen the Gulf, reopen the Gulf. Okay, how's that going? Well, it's not going very well. You sign this MOU and you say they broke the MOU. In reality, they didn't do anything they said they wouldn't. They were going to control the Gulf and they were going to tell people where they had to move. We tried to circumvent that and move them through a different corridor. That provoked the Iranians. But I think the real goal was to get the war started again, because the real goal at this point is to destroy Iran. Now, what do I mean by destroy? You want to so completely weaken the government, the central government, and the society that Iran breaks up into smaller fragments or pieces. This has always been the Western goal in Ukraine against Russia. You know, nobody cares about Ukraine. Ukrainians are people we just use like tissue on the battlefield. They're the cannon fodder. And we keep providing them with whatever we think that we can get them that creates the illusion they're still alive out there. And they managed to do some serious damage. They reduced the refining capacity, at least temporarily, by about 38% through some of their unmanned strikes. Hasn't changed the war, doesn't make any difference on the battlefield, but you know, it creates the illusion of something in the hopes that more people will throw money away on the war with Russia. So that war has failed. Well, the same goals are now in effect with Iran. So you had to get the war started. We found a way to do it. We blamed them for breaking the MOU. Have to remember, in the United States, you have, I would say, at least 25 to 30% of the population is willing to believe anything you say that is bad about not just Iran, but Islam in general and Muslims in general. So that's helpful to the administration. But the people who are really behind all of this are people who support what we call the Israel lobby. And the most prominent members are these Zionist Jewish billionaires, some group of them, several of them, enormous quantities of money with which, over the years, they have been able to purchase the United States government for use. Now, what about the rest of the population? It doesn't fall into that almost 30% that I mentioned. Well, they don't want anything to do with the war in the Gulf. They're opposed to it. And I think if you look at the polling data, that comes through. The last time I looked, it was something like 73% of Americans questioned said we should be out of the Gulf. Well, more than that opposed World War I. Didn't make any difference. We were still dragged into the war. Right now, simply because most Americans don't think we should be involved in the Gulf, doesn't make any difference. Why not? Because the people paying for everything are the billionaires that support the Israel lobby. And the Israel lobby wants one thing: the destruction, dismemberment of Iran, because they're in the business of establishing the supremacy and hegemony of the Jewish state over everyone and everything in the region. They are linked to enormously powerful financial interests that want to take over the resources, just as they wanted to take over the resources that are now sitting under Russian control in eastern Ukraine. They want to take over the resources, the oil fields and so forth, that Iran possesses. They've effectively humbled the Arabs and beaten them down to the point where the Arabs will do almost anything they tell them to do. So the last man standing in the region at the moment is Iran, and Iran will not submit to Israeli demands. Now, there's another major player that could be just as challenging, if not even more so, than Iran, and that's the Turks, or Turkey. The Turks are an immensely powerful state, but their leader has chosen to straddle the fence in an effort to benefit in terms of territorial expansion and financial strength from all sides. How long will that go on is anybody's guess. I suspect at some point that will end and they will turn on the Israelis. But right now, Iran is staying the course. It's maintaining its sovereignty, its independence against us and Israel. And we are really muscle for the Israeli program. You remember all these mafia movies? They'd say, well, come on, Tony, we know you're not really muscle. You're not one of the muscle guys, so talk to us, okay? We're the muscle. The question is, how long can we do this? Well, we've got two big problems. I talked about one of them at the beginning here, the financial issue. We've printed about all the money we can. If you look at our bond market, our 10-year, which is usually seen as the bellwether of serious crises, is at about 4.5, 4.6%. Most experts in the bond markets say that if we hit 5% in the 10-year bond, our entire financial structure will collapse. So that's one constraint. Second constraint, we only have so many missiles, and we're running out. And we can't manufacture them fast enough to keep up with the demand for the war. The Iranians, on the other hand, they've put everything into manufacturing, they've put it underground, and they can turn out missiles and unmanned systems at a much higher rate, much greater speed than we can. And behind them stand preeminently China and Russia. China is heavily invested in Iran. It buys most of Iran's oil. In addition to that, though, Iran is a key player in the Chinese Belt and Road. This is the structure of transportation and commerce the Chinese and the Russians have collaborated on across Central Asia so that you would be able to effectively move goods from Shanghai overland all the way to Rochefort on the west coast of France, and then from there to the United States or anywhere else in the Western Hemisphere, and do it very quickly and less expensively. So they're invested there, but they also see something else. Remember, we have imprudently threatened the Chinese on numerous occasions, especially about Taiwan. And the Chinese are not interested in that. We have the Shanghai Communique, which we signed in 1973, that said Taiwan is part of China. End of story. And everybody's accepted that until we got to Joe Biden and now Donald Trump. So the Chinese are saying, well, there's no interest on our part or incentive on our part to try and broker a quote-unquote deal with the United States if that means the United States turns around and tries to attack us. And the good news to the Chinese that all of the technology that they would rely on in a war against us is performing brilliantly against us in Iran. So you put all of this together, it's a pretty grim picture right now. We're not going to win anything. And I think asking that question right up front is key. Well, what the hell are we winning? And nobody can really tell you that. Well, we're making Israel great again. I mean, that's some people will laugh and say that,
Yeah. Very, very interesting points there. And I mean, appreciate you laying it out in that way. So I'm kind of curious about the issue of nuclear weapons come up. I think when Trump had told Congress, Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon, and many of Congress stood up in support and such. And so I began looking at the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action because I'm not an Obama apologist, but when Trump criticizes Obama's deal, it's pretty interesting because when I was looking at the actual, this is from the International Atomic Energy Agency. So we see that the deal was signed in 2015, going into 2016, and the stockpiles of enriched uranium fell off a cliff. And then it continued that way until the U.S. left the agreement back in I think it was 2018, around that time, and that was when Trump was president. Since we left that deal, the increase in the stockpiles of enriched uranium has continued to go upwards. And so it's interesting to hear Trump criticize Obama for the deal when the deal actually, according to, this data point, actually reduced the enriched uranium significantly. And then he took us out, and then now we're back to where we were prior to the original deal. What's your assessment of this? Is this, what's your assessment of it? I don't even know how to frame it into a question.
No, I understand completely. And I think that particular picture that you've shown everybody is a very good one. We need to understand that when the American government embarked on discussions with the Iranians under President Obama, the goal was to find a way out of this one-way street to nuclear weapons. The Iranians were receptive because the Iranians concluded it made more sense for them to become and remain a nuclear threshold state than it did to become a nuclear armed state. In other words, we're going to enrich uranium to a certain level, 20%, 30%, 40%, whatever. And this is going to be for industrial, internal, and medical use only. And they always knew, and we knew, that they would still be able in an emergency or a crisis to enrich it to 90+% to create plutonium. Plutonium being the critical component of a nuclear weapon. That's enriched uranium, highly enriched uranium. We call it plutonium. But we said, fine, that works for us. We set up a system that allowed international monitoring so that if the Iranians decided that they were going to press ahead and start ramping up, we would know about it. And the Iranians basically said to the Trump administration, who walked away from this, well, if you're walking away from the agreement, we have no choice but to enrich uranium to a point where if we have to, we could conceivably build a weapon. However, the supreme leader at the time, whom we recently assassinated, along with his whole family, had stated that it was fundamentally immoral and illegal for Iran to have nuclear weapons. And the Iranian state followed that prohibition. He is gone. His family was killed. His son has succeeded him, I guess. And there is now talk inside Iran of potentially building a nuclear weapon. Now, why would they want to do that? Well, I think it has something to do with the relentless, unending attacks of Israeli and American armed forces on Iran. Because the lesson historically that was learned back in 1991 was if you don't want to end up like Saddam Hussein, you really need a nuclear weapon to deter the Americans from attacking you. We didn't face a nuclear threat in Iraq, so we could use our high-end conventional dominance. Well, if you have a nuclear weapon, suddenly your high-end conventional dominance is no longer a guarantee of victory because you could suddenly lose great quantities of people and equipment to a nuclear strike. I can't predict the future. I'm not Nostradamus. But I think in retrospect, we can say, first of all, it was a very serious mistake to end that agreement. That agreement may not have been perfect, but it worked. The problem is it was always an Israeli talking point. The lobby opposed it. The lobby didn't want an agreement because the lobby wants the destruction of the regime and ultimately now the society and the state. That's as far as the Israelis are concerned and their Jewish billionaire backers in the United States. Israel cannot exist in the region if there is a powerful nuclear armed Iran.
Okay. So could this end in like a nuclear disaster? Do you think Trump has the, I guess, cojones to like to like nuke Iran or something like that? Could this get as bad as that?
Well, as irrational and emotional as he often is, I do think he understands that the use of a nuclear weapon would be catastrophic for the world. Now, why is that? Because if he or the Israelis or the Iranians or anybody else used a nuclear weapon, that would end the widely accepted, almost universal consensus that nuclear weapons are off the table for anything other than defense of national territory. That's very important because that was what the Soviets agreed to. That's what we agreed to in fundamental terms. We will not use a nuclear weapon against each other. We will confine our use of a nuclear weapon, if it becomes necessary, to the defense of our homeland. That's all. If we were to use one over there against Iran, we're no longer defending our homeland. Of course, we're not defending our homeland as it is, but we're now legitimating the use of a nuclear weapon for purposes other than homeland defense. So I don't think President Trump will do that. I hope I'm right, but you know, all things are possible. I worry much more about the Israelis because they have various programs, one of which is called the Samson option, that effectively say if we think someone else in the region has a nuclear weapon or we could be nuked, then we will preempt and we will nuke them. I hope not, because I think that would spell the end for Israel. Israel's a very small state. If they were to use such a weapon and there was a nuclear response, which I think they could almost certainly reckon with, that would be the end of Israel. Now, would the Iranians use a nuclear weapon if they have it? I don't know. I don't think so. I have heard rumors on the internet that the decision makers in Tehran are discussing the use of a nuclear device as a demonstration somewhere down in the open deserts of southern Iran, a small nuclear detonation just to demonstrate to everyone we have it, on the assumption that that'll scare everyone off. And my argument against that was very simple. If you do that, you make it inevitable that the Israelis will strike you, because they'll say, see, there's a nuclear weapon. To survive, we have to strike Iran. That would be catastrophic. And I don't see how such an action would not result in the inevitable intervention into the larger war by Russia and China, and potentially others. Clearly, the Turks would then rapidly gain access to a weapon from Pakistan, no doubt in my mind. Then Israel would have a nuclear-armed Turkey right on its border.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, my advice, and it's been from the beginning, Daryl, President Trump, quit. Stop. Yeah. There is no good military solution to this problem. Don't waste any more time. We don't live in the region. We just don't live there. We have demonstrated that we cannot protect the partners that we have in the region. The United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia. We can't. And that's what the Iranians have demonstrated to their friends on the west side of the Persian Gulf. You've sponsored these bases. You've threatened us. Welcome to the party. If you do this in the future, we will annihilate you. So there's not much we can do about that. And I think what we need to do, and this is something that all great powers should consider doing, is telling some of the smaller states with whom we have good relations, don't drag us into your war. Get along with your neighbor.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, if you're Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, Slovakia, whomever, don't run to us and try to involve us in a war with Russia. Try to get along with your neighbor. That's something that we used to do. We did that in the 19th century. We need to get back to that because we don't see any benefit to being involved in other people's wars. We are fighting someone else's war. This is a war on behalf of the state of Israel and its supporters in the United States. It is not a war that benefits the United States in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah. How close would you say we are to a World War III type scenario? I mean, we got the Russia-Ukraine situation still hot, and then we have this situation here. And it seems like we're playing with fire, with a World War III type scenario. So do you think that we could be close shifting towards that if something doesn't change?
I think we have to consider that probability as fairly high at this point. That's why I said, quit, stop. That's the answer. The answer is to stop fighting immediately. Pick some third country somewhere to hold negotiations. I would stop supplying Ukraine. I mean, they've already lost between 1.5 and 1.8 million Ukrainian soldiers killed in action. Add to that another million plus that have been wounded. These are the real figures, not the phony figures that NATO publishes or we publish or Canada publishes. Forget it. Those are the real losses. The population of Ukraine is being cut by 50%. They've left the country or they've died or been killed. So you've got what, 20 million, 21 million maybe left out of a nation of over 40 million at the beginning? This doesn't make sense. When this sort of thing happens, you stop. You recognize you can't go on or you're going to lose everything. That still hasn't happened. And the Europeans are still pressing for more, but they're pressing us. I don't think we're going to do it. I think we're going to back out. And that will make it very hard for Mr. Zelensky to continue. But in the Middle East, we don't have too much flexibility because I think Mr. Trump is beholden to these billionaires for holding his office as president. I think the entire city of Washington is in their hands financially. Everyone's on the payroll. Everyone wants to retire and be wealthy. How do you do that? Well, these billionaires can make that happen. And they do, for the people that do what they want, whether they're retired military or political or anything else. It's a bad situation, but I think, Lou Dobbs was someone on CNN, and he used to say, never forget that we Americans have the best government money can buy. He was right. It's being bought. It doesn't represent us.
Yeah. What do you think happens in the midterms? I mean, that's coming up soon. It seems like there's a lot of efforts to influence that in one way or another. I've seen like some of the approval ratings of Trump and some of the Republican Party and such. And so what do you think happens in that? Does anything change if there's a shift or a balance of, the House and the Senate or any of that?
I think that we will probably lose control of the House, that is the Republican Party. But there are a lot of people who've concluded, much as I have, that the two parties really no longer respond to us. We need another way forward. We need a third movement, a third party. So I think a lot of people feel that way. Chip Roy, who's a very competent member of the House, has stated that publicly. I agree with him. Tucker has said so. I think we need to get there. But now in the meantime, before we've gotten there, we're dealing with the two-party system. And I think the Republicans will probably lose seats in the House. Now, what does that mean? Does it mean that's instant impeachment time for Trump? Probably. And even if the Republicans hold the Senate, it's going to be close, but let's assume they do. Could he still be impeached? I would say yes, because there are at least 10 or 12 members of the Senate and the Republican Party who hate Donald Trump. And between now and then, if I'm right, and I think I am, but I could be wrong, and oil approaches $150 a barrel, by the time you get to November, we're going to be in a very serious, deep recession, and much of the world is probably facing something that looks more like a depression. And we may end up there as well. So under those circumstances, whoever is in office in charge in the White House and in Congress is going to be gone. The problem is, what can we expect right now? Can we expect any real change? And I keep saying to people, look, if you didn't like Tony Blinken as foreign secretary or secretary of state, what's the difference between him and Rubio? None. They both said effectively the same things. You didn't like the economic policies? Well, there haven't been really dramatic changes, some for the better. But, how much difference has it made between Democrats and Republicans? And remember, he promised that as Trump, I'm going to restore the rule of law, which we desperately need. We need law and order in our streets. Yeah. And we also need to deal with this mass migration problem, the illegals. What are we going to do about it? He's failed, hasn't done it. And that's unacceptable, because that's really what people were concerned about. I mean, most Americans are very, very opposed to something that you call Sharia law. Sharia law is unacceptable to us. That's important, not bombing Iran.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you see the estimated cost to Americans increasing in this situation?
I think things will get worse, yes. Costs will rise. At some point, you get a trigger for something people normally refer to as a revolution. Now, what's that look like? I don't know. But it doesn't necessarily have to turn out to be hopelessly bloody. There may be some blood. But I think Americans will effectively come together and say, it's enough, no more. And there's a lot of resentment now in the United States for what I would call the ruling elites, the elite classes. These are the people with most of the money. 10% of the American population spends 90% of the money. And 1% has control of at least half of the wealth. And then you widen that to say 5 or 7% controls almost all the wealth. It's not a good picture. Now, you can have that if the people that are not terribly wealthy still enjoy a high standard of living and feel as though they have a say in the conduct of policy and the development of legislation. Well, we don't, and we don't have the high standard that we once did. We see it falling. So I think you're going to get, in some form, some revolutionary movement.
Mm-hmm. Well, Doug, appreciate you for coming on the show and sharing your thoughts on the current situation. Where can the audience read more of your work or watch some of your other interviews?
I would certainly go to my Substack. I've written a piece that's out this week it's called Macgregor Warrior Diplomacy, and it's called Trump's War to the Last Missile. And I think they'll find it very useful and interesting. I also have a YouTube channel, same title, Warrior Diplomacy, Macgregor Warrior Diplomacy. You can see all the various things that I've done in the past and what I'm doing now. Let me finish up on one point. I just want to mention this because I think it's so important for Canada as well as for us. Regardless of who comes to power in the future, however this government comes and goes, we're Americans and Canadians. We have to think about something that I call resource sovereignty. That's resource independence. We are struggling right now because we did not pay attention to the fact that you can find rare earths all over the world. It's refining them. It's developing alloys based on them that requires enormous quantities of energy. Heating minerals to 1100 or 1200 degrees centigrade. That means enormous quantities of energy coming either from coal, oil, or nuclear power, or hydropower. We don't have these refineries that we need. In other words, even if we were sitting on top of 50 tons of potential rare earths, we couldn't do much about it. If you want to refine your rare earth, you have to send it right now to Indonesia. Why? Because the Japanese invested money so that they could extract the rare earths down there and refine them down there. The Japanese were very smart. They did that in 2010 when the Chinese refused to export any more rare earths to them. We didn't pay any attention. We should have. And we need to start looking carefully at all these critical minerals, and I include gold and silver, uranium. There's a list that the U.S. government has that's 60 long, 60 minerals, including rare earths. We have to build our own sovereignty. because whether we like it or not, over time, we may have to become Fortress America because we will not have access to many of the things overseas that have had in the past. I would argue that a lot of that is our fault because we've meddled in other people's affairs where we shouldn't have. But we need to prepare for it and need to think about it. I hope your leadership in Canada will, and I'm hopeful that we will, but we'll see.